So today we're going to talk about the 5 reflections. What are they and how can we use them in our daily life? Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. And one of the ways that we can live wiser and kinder and less stress-filled lives is to keep in mind these contemplations, these kinds of things that we can consider every day, because they really do help us to understand our lives in a deeper and more fundamental way. And when the Buddha did mention them actually in the Pali Canon, he said that they were to be often reflected upon by all members of what we might call the Fourfold Sangha. That is to say, not just monastics, but also lay people, not just men, but also women. Everybody who is interested in this kind of practice should reflect upon these things regularly. At least that was the instruction we got in the early texts. So the first of these reflections is that I am subject to old age. I'm not exempt from old age. That is, old age is something that's going to befall me and everybody that I know. It's something that we have to keep in mind. It's something that we can't shirk from, that we can't back away from, that we can't pretend doesn't exist. That's our first reflection. And of course, it's not just that we ourselves will, in a sense, decay over time, that we'll become less and less able to do what we want to do, that our bodies and our minds will decline slowly over time, or maybe more rapidly, but also things around us will decay, that nothing that we have ownership or potential ownership of is going to be the same throughout our ownership, and things will break down, things will stop working properly. It's something to keep in mind when we tend to grasp and possess ownership of things. The second of these reflections is that I'm subject to illness, that I haven't overcome illness in my life. It's something also to consider, that illness is a normal part of life, that it's something that will befall all of us. And sometimes you will hear or read people interested in the sciences talking about sort of overcoming all of human illness. This is something that I think is not going to happen. I don't think that's the sort of thing that we should keep in our minds as a possibility. Now, biology being the way it is, we're always going to have new forms of virus and new forms of infection and attack from outside that we're not going to be able to get away from. And even without those, we're certainly going to have the possibilities of injury and physical damage that happens to us all. And this kind of reflection can also help to put our own health into its proper place. That health is not something that's a guarantee. So those of us who are healthy, or when we're healthy, we should keep that in mind. It's not the sort of thing that we can expect to continue forever. And also it can help us to put illnesses in their proper place when they occur to us. That is, that illness is a normal part of life. It's not something that we can ever expect to get away from. So that we shouldn't feel that illness is somehow extremely unusual, or why did this happen to me? It happened to me because it happens to everybody, and there's no way to get away from it. The third of these reflections is that I'm subject to death, and I'm not exempt from death. Death is something that befalls all of us. No matter how, no matter how much people will talk about, future advances in the sciences and in medicine, sort of getting lives longer, so we have a longer lifespan on this world. Of course, what we want really is quality of life, not length of life. But even considering that, the chances of us ever getting to much over, let's say, 100, 120 years, even in the foreseeable far future, is not going to happen, really. And no matter what we do, death will eventually befall all of us, simply because the universe has its own limits. We'll eventually have the heat death of the universe. So death is something that we cannot get away from. It's something we can't escape. And that means, of course, that no matter how much effort we put into our lives, no matter how much effort and diligence we put into accumulating power and wealth and fame and all the rest of these kinds of positive things that people tend to want, we're going to eventually have to let them go. And that's a sobering thought for, I think, many of us. But it's something that should really spur us on practice, onto this kind of wisdom practice, of trying to understand, trying to get the best way to understand wealth and honor and fame and all these other things that we claim to want in life, because eventually they will come to an end. And it doesn't matter how many Toys we've accumulated during our lives, eventually they'll go to somebody else, or they'll simply decay and be destroyed. So that's something always to keep in mind. The fourth reflection is that I must be parted and separated from everyone and everything that's dear and agreeable to me. And this is probably the hardest reflection to come to terms with in our lives. We might think, in a superficial way, that death is the hardest. But I think for many of us, actually, death, although obviously difficult to see beyond, there are practices. For instance, Epicurus has a very famous practice in early Greek philosophy, which is this: that when I am here, death isn't here. And when death is here, I'm not here. So what's there to worry about? So in other words, death is kind of an abstract. Death is something that we come to in the abstract because while we're around, we're alive. And while we're thinking about it, we're alive. And when it arrives, we'll no longer be here. So there's a sense in which it's something that only exists as a problem in the abstract. Whereas this particular contemplation, that everything dear to us will eventually go away, may indeed be not abstract, but actually concrete in our lives. That we may lose people who we love. We may lose our family members. We may lose our dear friends. We may lose things dear to us like houses or possessions or statuses in life, power, fame. These things are fleeting. All of these things are things that will go, that will leave us. And so we have to come to terms with those facts. And indeed, this kind of contemplation is a direct route towards non-clinging, towards non-identification, towards the understanding that identifying ourselves with other people or other things or abstract possibilities like fame and wealth and all the rest are not the wise way to live. That renunciation, a certain amount of healthy renunciation is really good for us because it makes us understand that we renounce things that in fact we have no power over, that in fact we have no control over, things that will decay and pass away, which isn't to mean that we don't have care for them, that we don't have compassion for them, that we don't consider them people or family to be dear to us and friends of ours and beloved of ours. But it means that we have to understand that all of these things will have their time span. And the fifth one of these reflections is a little bit longer, and I'll read it here. It's, I am the owner of my karma, the heir of my karma. I have karma as my origin, karma as my relative, karma as my resort. I will be the heir of whatever karma, good and bad, that I do. And there are various ways to understand karma and the way that the role that karma plays in our lives. Probably the most specific to these reflections is one that the Buddha discusses when he discusses the reflections, which is why we should reflect upon these things at all. And the reason, he says, is that when we don't reflect upon these things, when we forget these things, when we forget these facts of life, because they are facts of life, we have a greater tendency towards misconduct in one way or another. Whether that's actual ethical misconduct in the sense of really doing things that are wrong, like killing people, injuring people, lying, stealing, sexual misconduct, or whether it's simply misconduct in minor ways, such as clinging to things that we shouldn't, identifying ourselves with parts of the world that we shouldn't, doing things that, while not ethically wrong, nevertheless are going to eventually result in suffering for ourselves or others. And that's where we get into this fifth reflection, with the issue of karma. And there is a traditional and a more secular way of understanding karma here. I think many of us of a more secular bent will be a little bit turned off by the notion of karma here, and others of a more traditional bent will not. And so I'd like to discuss both of these because I think that they are important and interesting. At least to know whether or not you accept one or the other is of, I think, less concern to me than that you know the options. So there's clearly a traditional way of understanding this fifth reflection, that our past karma and past lives of ours has led to where we are now in our life here, that our karma here may lead to better or worse results in a future life, And in many, many suttas, but in particular I would say the Chula Kamavibhanga Sutta, which is a sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha discusses in some detail the ways in which what we do here, what we did in the past, makes our life the way it is in this life, and what our actions in this life will result in future benefit or harm. So if you tend to take a traditional interpretation, then you might be interested in that sutta because he gives some information there that is important to that kind of understanding. But there are problems, I think, with a traditional understanding of karma. In fact, as Bhikkhu Bodhi himself has said, Bhikkhu Bodhi being a very eminent and great translator of the early material and very much a traditionalist, he himself has raised these issues, that a traditional understanding of karma can be used to justify the status quo in a rigidly stratified society, or even a less rigidly stratified society. People who are in positions of power and influence and wealth may come to believe, given this kind of a doctrine, that their power and wealth is legitimate simply because the doctrine claims that they earned this wealth, if not in this life, then in a prior life. So if they were born into power, if they were born into status, if they were born into privilege, a privilege that they themselves didn't earn in this life, they may say, well, I didn't earn it in this life, but I must have earned it in a prior life. And similarly, it may seem from this kind of a doctrine that people who are less fortunate, people who are poor, people who are in misery, have somehow earned that because of mistakes that they made in prior lives, even if they did nothing in this life. And that kind of justification of stratifications, of inequalities in society can be a problem with a traditional interpretation of karma. And it's one that has to be kept in mind as a problem. Even if we're traditionalists, then we have to keep that in mind as a problem with the view, and one that we have to overcome in our daily lives in the way we practice. And if we're of a less traditional bent, then it may be a reason to think twice about this interpretation. But I will say on the other side that there is a potential benefit to a kind of a traditional karmic understanding. For some people, that is to say, some people believe that injustice requires punishment. In other words, that there's a real problem if people who are unjust in this life don't receive punishment for that. And to the extent that you view ethics in this way, it may be helpful to you to think of there being past or future lives in which punishment is inevitable, because that's going to tend to make you relax around the necessity of getting punishment right now. On the other hand, if you are a secular believer, then you're going to say, well, there isn't a future life, then there's no sure justice, and then there's really even more of, I think, a stress in this life on punishing people who have done bad. And that, of course, can lead to hatred, can lead to resentment. And there's a sutta that I'll put down below where the Buddha actually does talk about ways of removing resentment. And of course, one way he says of removing resentment is to say, well, look, even though they're doing better than they should in this life, in the next life they'll have their comeuppance, as it were, or some point in the future, anyhow. And so that is one potential benefit, psychological benefit, of thinking of in the more traditional kinds of ways about karma. But you won't be surprised to hear that I tend towards a more secular interpretation, and I did an earlier video on karma, which I'll put up here. But basically, what we have to keep in mind is that what we do in this life matters, that it makes a difference whether we act skillfully or unskillfully. We live in this world together, and if we can act in a beneficial way, in a way that's helpful to all of us, it will make for a better world going forward. Or to put it a different way, acting skillfully is prudent. It's in our own interest. It's in the interest of people that we love. It's in the interest of everyone. So that's the reason to do it. I mean, of course, it's ethically good, it's right, it's the right thing to do, but even more, it's the prudent thing to do. And it's that kind of good action, of prudent action, that will outlive us. Or the reverse. If we act imprudently, if we act in rash ways that make the world worse, that also will outlive us. The character of our actions will go into the future, into future lives of other people who surround us. All of our efforts will eventually decay and die out as the universe progresses. But at least in the foreseeable future, we can make a difference. We can make a difference for good or for ill. And so that is the reason, I think, to keep in mind something like this fifth contemplation. While renunciation is useful and skillful and wise in certain respects, withdrawing into a kind of a catatonia is not going to be helpful. That we still have to live in the world, that we still should strive as best we can to be kind and compassionate to other people, to other beings. And so keeping that in mind is what the point of the fifth of these contemplations is. I think it's one of the more it's one of the ones that we have to work the hardest to get our mind around, but it's there for a reason. So consider meditating upon all 5 of these contemplations. If you like, some people do it every day. I know I've heard some people say that when they get up in the morning, they consider these 5 reflections. That may be something that you would like to consider, or at least consider reflecting on them when you can, because they're very powerful. And let me know how you use them in your life. Have you ever considered using them? Have you done this kind of contemplation before? Would you consider doing it now? I'd be interested to hear how you see these fitting into your life. I hope this has been useful. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. So be well.